Jorvin earns 3 crowns. On Monday morning, Pele woke up early because Yum Yum was whining, and he took him into his bed. With his nose burrowed under Pele's chin, the puppy went to sleep again, but Pele did not. It would be madness to sleep when he could lie awake and know that this soft, warm little thing that he had close to him was Yum Yum, his own puppy. How wonderful that you could be so completely happy. In the middle of all this happiness, he remembered Moses. It seemed a little unfair that he did not miss him as much as he should have. But he explained to the sleeping Yum Yum, "Moses doesn't miss me either. I'm quite sure of that. He's swimming around, playing with the other seals, and enjoying himself like anything." A moment later he thought of Yoka too. That hurt a little, not so much for Yoka's sake, perhaps, but because it reminded him of what could happen when the world sometimes became an Isle of Sorrow. He pushed away these thoughts, which was not difficult, for at the moment Yum Yum woke up and was immediately full of life. He nosed Pele's face and licked him, worried his pajamas, and barked and jumped around on the bed. And Pele laughed. It was a laugh so full of happiness that Mullen stopped making toast downstairs just to enjoy it. What might not happen on a day that began with a boy's happy laughter and with such lovely weather? Last week had been unbearable, with nothing but wind and rain and cold, and then suddenly a wonderful morning like this one. Mullen decided to serve breakfast outside in the garden. Her father was dressing in his room behind the kitchen, and he sang as he did so. "You mustn't sing on an empty stomach," Mullen shouted at him, "or you'll cry before evening. Didn't you know that?" "Utter nonsense," said Melker, and he came out into the kitchen singing. "Don't you think we've cried enough?" he said. "There really has to be an end to all this weeping and wailing." Together they prepared for breakfast on the garden table. Mullen stood in the kitchen and handed out the things to Melker through the window. When everything was ready, Melker looked around. "And where are my 3 hungry boys?" The 2 eldest came up from the shore. They had been out early fishing. They had not caught anything, but sitting there in the morning sun made them feel that the hours were not being wasted, and anyhow it gave them an appetite for breakfast. "Oh, Mullen, you have made waffles." Nicholas looked at his sister and the waffles with great satisfaction. "Yes, I've made them out of gratitude to this Monday morning." Just to make everything as lovely as possible, Melker nodded in agreement. "Yes, it's a wonderful morning and a wonderful breakfast table laid by Melker himself. Waffles, chocolate, coffee, toast, butter, cheese, marmalade, jam, and wasps. What more could anyone ask? "Did you invite the wasps too?" asked Johann. "No, those little devils came out of their own accord." "What a pity we have to put up with that wasp's nest this year too." Melker shooed away a couple of wasps from the marmalade jar, but even if Pele was sitting with the world's most wonderful puppy on his knees, there was still room in his heart for all other animals, and he said reproachfully, "You leave my wasps alone, Daddy. They want to live at Carpenter's cottage too. Can't you understand that, just like we do?" And of course Melker understood all about wanting to live in Carpenter's cottage. They all understood that. "It's odd how very fond one gets of this tumble-down old dump," said Mullen. The wall behind her, the red Carpenter's cottage wall, gave out a warmth that was not only due to sunshine. Mullen was convinced. She thought of the house almost as a living being, a secure and warmly alive being, which had taken them all to its heart. "Tumble down, oh come, it's not exactly that," said Melker. "The walls need repairing here and there, but the house is built of sound old weathered timber. There's some rot, of course, but if it were my house, I would soon fix that and make it into such a splendid place that it would astonish you all. If I had a dwelling in the uttermost parts of the sea and put a new roof on it, thought Pele. That would be something. And then this sight, said Melcher, you could never find its equal anywhere. And there they sat with their waffles, looking at each other and at their sight and their carpenter's cottage, and thinking that everything was absolutely marvelous. The jasmines were in flower, sending out their sweet perfume. The wild roses were full of pink buds, ready to burst at any moment. The grass was green and soft and sloped gently down toward the shore, where the seagulls screeched. Yes, it was absolutely marvelous, everything. And to think that an ordinary, simple carpenter could position his house so perfectly, said Melcher, with exactly the right view, making it look as if it had just grown up out of the ground by itself, and giving it a garden like this one. Are you sure, Daddy? It is certain, isn't it, that we'll live here always, said Pele. In the summer, I mean. Oh, yes, of course, said Melcher. Matson is coming today. He telephoned and told them so at the shop, so we will have our new contract at last. While the Melchersons sat finishing their breakfast, Jorvin was out for a little morning walk with Bosun. She went down to the jetty to feed the swans. They came every morning, and she gave them dry bread. There was a swan father and a swan mother and 7 gray balls of children. As she stood there, a large motorboat, which she did not recognize, came in toward the jetty. There were 3 people on board. One of them she knew to be Matson, who always came once or twice a year. The other one, a large fat man wearing a yachtsman's cap, she did not know. He was driving the boat, and she did not think he had ever been to Seacrow Island before, nor had the girl who was sitting beside him. Throw me the rope, said Jorvin, and Matson threw it to her, and she moored the boat. Clever girl, said the man with the yachting cap, when he had jumped ashore. That's a splendid knot. Jorvin laughed. Not, it's only a half-hitch. Said the man with the yachting cap. And where did you learn that? I've always known it, said Jorvin. Then he took 2 shining coins from his pocket and gave them to her. She stared at them in amazement, and then she smiled at him, but by now he was no longer paying any attention to her. Come on, Lottie, he shouted, and the girl jumped ashore. She was very pretty, thought Jorvin, with her slim, light blue jeans and shining brown hair, which was obviously permanently waved. Lucky girl to be allowed to have her hair done, although she was only about as old as Teddy, but she looked sulkily and did not pay any attention to Jorvin. She had a little white poodle in her arms, and Jorvin looked around for Bosun. It might be fun for him to meet a poodle, but Bosun had gone off along the shore and was halfway to Crow Point. Matson was on his way to Carpenter's cottage. Jorvin realized that, but why he had the other 2 with him, she simply could not understand, nor did she care. She followed them anyway, because she was on her way there to call for Pele. Ah, there you are at last, Mr. Matson, said Melcher when he saw the visitors. Come on in, and we'll clear the table so that we can sign the papers here. Matson was a small, nervous, self-important gentleman, and he wore a suit that made Mullen shudder. It was striped and quite horribly ugly, she thought, but surely it couldn't be just because of his suit that she felt so antagonistic toward him and the 2 others. Matson introduced his friends. This is Mr. Carlberg and his daughter. They would like to have a look at Carpenter's cottage. Certainly, said Melcher, but why do they want to? Matson explained that it was just that Mr. Schublem wanted to sell Carpenter's cottage. She was old and was tired of renting it, so— Wait a minute now, said Melcher. I've already rented this cottage, if I am not mistaken, and I was due to sign a new yearly contract today. Isn't that so, Matson? Unfortunately, it can't be done, said Matson. Miss Schublem wants to sell and no one can raise any objection to it. If you want to go on living here, buy the place. That is, if you can pay a better price than Mr. Carlberg has offered, of course." Melcher began to tremble. He felt despair rising inside him, almost suffocating him. How could anyone come and wreck everything just with a few words, both for him and for his children? Only 2 minutes ago they had been sitting there happy and gay, and then in one moment everything had been turned to dust and ashes. Buy the place, what a joke! Why, he couldn't buy so much as a dog's kennel with the income he had. A yearly rental was all that he could scrape together, but that he could do at any rate. And so he had confidently looked forward to spending year after year at Carpenter's Cottage. At last he had found a place where his children could put down roots and where they could spend their childhood summers, as he himself had once done, something beautiful to remember all their lives. And then someone arrives and says a couple of words and everything is over. He did not dare look at his children, but he heard Pélé's trembling voice. "Daddy, you said that we were always going to live here." Melcher swallowed violently. What hadn't he said? He had said they would live here for always, and that all the weeping and wailing was to be at an end. At least he thought he had said that, and now here he was, unable to do anything but howl like a dog in helplessness and despair. In the meantime Matson stood 2 yards away from him, leaning against the white beam, looking as if it were just an ordinary day, and all this just an ordinary bit of business. "Do you mean," said Melcher bitterly, "do you really mean that we have to leave here, me and my children?" "Not at this moment, naturally," said Matson, "but if Mr. Carlberg buys or someone else, then you will have to arrange with the new owner about how long you can stay here." Mr. Carlberg did not look at Melcher. He spoke to Matson as if no one else were present. "Yes, I'll certainly consider buying it if we can agree on the price. The house is nothing, of course, I can see that by looking at it, and it could easily be torn down, but you don't find a sight like this every day." Melcher could hear a dull murmur from his children, and he ground his teeth. Now Lottie Carlberg chimed into the conversation. "You're right, Daddy, the house is really dreadful, but we could build a lovely little bungalow, couldn't we? One like Carl and Anna Greta have." Her father nodded, but he looked a little worried. Perhaps he thought it was going a little too far to bring in Carl and Anna Greta's bungalow at this stage. Jorvin thought so too. She thought the whole thing had gone quite far enough. That Lottie sitting there on the steps of Carpenter's Cottage, as if the whole house belonged to her. Jorvin went and stood in front of her. "Lottie, do you know what?" she said. "I think you're a bungalow yourself. You big fat thing." Lottie realized at once that she had made an enemy, and not only one. All those children who were standing staring at her were her enemies. But she didn't care. On the contrary, she enjoyed it, for she was confident of her superiority. It was her father who could decide whether these children should be allowed to live here or not, so that they had better behave. They needn't glare at her like that, as if she had no right to be there. "I suppose people have the right to buy places if they want," she said, to no one in particular, looking straight ahead of her. "Of course," said Teddy, "and build bungalows like Carl and Anna Greta's. Go ahead by all means." "This old rubbish dump can easily be torn down," said Freddie. "Just you try." Teddy and Freddie had arrived as soon as they heard what was happening. In the shop they knew, in some supernatural way, all that had happened on the island almost before it had happened, and Teddy and Freddie wanted to be their friends in their hour of need. What were friends for otherwise? Never had they seen Johann and Nicholas so depressed and gloomy, and Pélé, he was still sitting at the breakfast table. his face white as chalk, and beside him sat Malin. Her arm was around Pele, and she looked quite pale too. It was all quite unbearable, and then that snobby girl had to start shouting and building bungalows. Was it any wonder Teddy and Freddie were furious? "What is a bungalow?" asked Jorvin of her older and wiser sisters. "A crazy person, obviously," said Freddie. "Someone absolutely, completely crazy, just like her," said Teddy, jerking her thumb toward Lottie. It was terrible to think that perhaps they would have her as a neighbor instead of Johann and Nicholas and Pele and Malin and Uncle Melcher. "It might be a good idea to take a look inside," said Mr. Carlberg, and for the first time he turned toward Melcher. "Oh, with your permission, of course, Mr. Melcherson," but he said, managing to sound both pleasant and superior. "Yes, of course," Mr. Melcherson consented. How could he do otherwise? He was a beaten man, and he knew it, but he went in with them, and so did Malin. Her father must not be left alone with these two men who wanted to take his carpenter's cottage away from him. And anyhow, she would not dream of allowing anyone to wander around their home and criticize everything they had loved so much. It was a home for people to live in and enjoy, and it was theirs. Malin knew that. Carpenter's cottage and the Melchersons belonged to each other, but now other people had arrived, who only noticed that the floors shook and the windows were a little crooked, and there were patches of damp on the ceiling in one or two places. Poor old Carpenter's cottage! Malin felt that she had to protect it, and so she stood holding the door open for the unbidden guests and for her father. She gave him a secret, comforting nudge, and he looked at her with a grateful, apologetic, miserable smile. Lottie did not go in with them. The house was to be pulled down if Daddy bought it, and she wanted to stay out here with the children and enjoy her superiority. There were 6 of them, but it would be exciting to see if she could manage 6 enemies at once. She usually managed to deal with situations like these pretty well, for she was sure of herself. It had never been difficult for her to make enemies, so she had had plenty of practice. Besides, she had Missy, her poodle, so she was not quite alone, and Missy, at any rate, thought exactly as she did, that Lottie Carlberg was something very grand and important. It strengthened her to feel Missy's support. She held the little poodle in her arms so that she would not go for Pele's puppy, and then, humming, she walked around the house, as if to inspect it, although her real motive was to see how far she could go in annoying those children, who stood there staring at her in absolute silence. It took courage to walk up and down in front of their hostile eyes, and she could never have done it if she had not felt so absolutely superior. She did not need to bother about 6 country children. "Missy, darling," she said, "will you like living here in this summer? In a new house, of course, not in this rickety dump." She grabbed hold of a window to show Missy how rickety it was, but that window belonged to the larder and it was loose. The Melcherson children knew that, but Lottie did not, and she was a little taken aback when she suddenly found herself standing with the window in her hand. She made totally useless efforts to put it back until Nicholas came and took it from her. He fixed it up and said coldly, "You could at least wait to begin tearing down the rickety old dump until you've bought it." Lottie stuck her nose in the air. She did not feel quite as happy as before. To hide her embarrassment, she tried to get into conversation with Pele. He had a dog too, and dogs were something you could always talk about. "I see you've got a cocker spaniel," she said. Pele did not answer. What he had was no business of hers, and just now he was in such despair that it was hardly his business either. "They're very sweet, of course, but not particularly intelligent," said Lottie. "Poodles are much more intelligent." Pele remained silent, which made Lottie feel awkward. All this silence was making her feel unsure of herself, so she turned to Jorvin instead. "You would like to have a little dog too, I expect, wouldn't you?" Jorvin had stared at Lottie with more hostility than anyone, but now she smiled broadly. "I've got a little dog. Would you like to see him?" Lottie shook her head. "No, don't bring another dog. Missy will only get angry and go for him." "Then she's a bungalow too," said Jorvin. "But I bet you she wouldn't go for my dog." "That's what you think," said Lottie. "I don't know Missy." "Would you like to bet?" said Jorvin. "Bet you a crown." She held up one of the coins that Lottie's father had given her. "All right," said Lottie, "but you'll only have yourself to blame." She noticed that a sort of sigh of expectation went through the crowd of children. Oh well, if they were really so keen on dog fights, she would show them. Missy was certainly small, but she was very quick-tempered, and she often got herself into fights with dogs much bigger than herself, and smaller too, of course. The ladies in Nortage called her the terror of the town. "She goes around as if she thought she were a Great Dane," one of them had said only yesterday when Missy had gone for her big boxer. So if these brats wanted to see a dog fight, they could. Missy always won. "Keep your puppy out of the way," said Lottie to Pele. "I'm letting Missy go," and she did. She put Missy on the ground, and all they had to do was wait for the dog to attack. Bosun, back from his walk, was lying asleep behind the lilac hedge, but he got up willingly when Jorvin woke him. He rose to his feet, and in all his towering hugeness he came around the corner. There was a shriek. It came from Missy's owner. Missy herself stood stock-still for one dreadful moment, looking at the monster that was approaching. Then she gave a howl and raced out of the gate like a streak of white smoke. Bosun looked after her in surprise. Why was she in such a hurry? She might at least have said, "How do you do?" Bosun himself, polite dog that he was, came forward to greet Lottie, but Lottie gave another shriek and ran behind the white beam. "Take your dog away," she shouted wildly. "Take him away." "What are you screaming about?" said Jorvin. "Bosun doesn't attack anyone. He's not a bungalow." Johann was lying on his face in the grass, groaning with laughter. He might just as easily have been crying. In fact, that would have been more understandable. But now he was laughing, and he could not stop. "Oh, Jorvin," he moaned. "Oh, Jorvin." Jorvin gave him a surprised glance, but then she turned to Lottie. "I won. You owe me a crown." Lottie had emerged from behind the tree when she heard that Bosun was not dangerous, but now she was both shy and angry, and did not want to stay with the children any more. Grudgingly she fished out of her purse and gave Jorvin her crown. "Thank you," said Jorvin. She stood with her head on one side gazing at Lottie. "People like you shouldn't make bets," she said. "That's only for people like me and Uncle Melker." Lottie looked impatiently toward the door of Carpenter's cottage. Wasn't her father ever coming so that they could go? She did not want to stay here any longer. "Guess what Uncle Melker had a bet about once," said Jorvin, although it was years ago, of course. Lottie was not interested about what Uncle Melker had done years ago, but Jorvin did not worry about that. He bet with a friend that he wouldn't eat for 14 days or sleep for 14 nights. What do you think of that? "Crazy," said Lottie. "He couldn't." "Yes, he could," said Jorvin dramatically, "because he slept in the day and ate at night." "What do you say now?" "Oh, Jorvin," groaned Johann. But then he stopped laughing, for Mr. Karlberg had come out with Matson, and Johann had heard the awful thing he said. All of them had heard. The house is worthless, but I'll buy it nevertheless. I don't think one could go wrong with this site. I'll just talk it over with my wife," he said. "Shall we arrange that I come to your office tomorrow at 4 o'clock? Would that suit you?" "Splendid," said Matson. They all sat in the kitchen of Carpenter's cottage that evening, the Grantvists and the Melkersons. They had sat there so many evenings, but they had never been so depressed or subdued before. For what could they say? Melker was silent. He could not speak because of the awful ache in his chest. Niece and Marta looked shyly at him. They had tried to convey to him how sorry they were about it all, and how they would miss him and his family, but Melker looked so upset that they gave up. Now they sat in silence while the summer dusk sank mercifully over the kitchen. In its darkness everyone could devote himself to his gloomy thoughts, quite undisturbed. What a strange summer, thought Malin. She remembered the first one as a calm, peaceful, and uneventful. But what had happened to this one? At one moment, Peter bringing complete and unbounded happiness, the next tears of despair. First the business of Pele and Yoka, and now this last bitter, unendurable affair, which would be the end of everything. Yes, it was truly a bitter end. Jorvin lay on the floor with Bosun beside her, and Pele sat with his back against the woodbin and Yum-Yum on his knee. As far as Pele was concerned, life, even in the ordinary way, was something of a switchback ride, with enormous jerks between what was fun and what was sad. And just now, in spite of Yum-Yum, he was as low as he could possibly be. Worst of all was that Daddy was in such despair. He could endure anything but seeing Daddy so sad, or Malin, or Johann, or Nicholas. They must not be so miserable. Pele could not bear it. He held Yum-Yum against his cheek, and sought a little comfort from his warmth and softness, but it did not help much. Jorvin was crying, quietly and furiously. This morning she had been brave, because she had not really understood what it was all about. Now she knew, and it was enough to make one burst. She was very sorry for herself, too. Why should people make such a muddle of things? First it was Westerman, and now this old Karlberg and his stupid Lottie. To blazes with all of them. Poor Pele, she wanted to give him something to make him happy. She had no seal to give him this time. She had nothing. Then she heard Freddie say, over in the corner, "Money, money, money, it's not fair that it should mean so much. Blast Karlberg." And suddenly Jorvin remembered who didn't have money. She had a whole pocketful of it. Why, she had 3 crowns. "Pele, I'm going to give you something," whispered Jorvin, so that no one else would hear, and she smuggled the 3 crowns over to him. She was almost ashamed to give it, for even if it was a very large sum of money, it would not go very far when anyone was as miserable as Pele was. "How nice you are, Jorvin," said Pele in a hoarse little voice. He did not think that 3 crowns were all that much help when one was as unhappy as this, but it helped that Jorvin wanted to give them to him. The secret 4 sat together in a corner. They were not secret any more, only gloomy. They had planned so much for this summer. They were going to repair the hut on Knorken Island. They were going to build a new and much bigger raft. They were going to go around the islands with tents and be away for a whole week. They were going to borrow the motor and go right out to Cap Point and look at the great cave there, and then Bjorn had promised to take them on a fishing trip, and they had thought they would make a headquarters for the secret club in the attic of Carpenter's cottage. Of course, it was not too late even now, for Johann and Nicholas were still at Carpenter's cottage, so they could do a good deal of what they wanted to do, but it did not seem fun any more. The desire had gone. "It's strange," said Johann. I don't care about anything any more." "Neither do I," said Nicholas. Teddy and Freddie sighed. When the Gronkvists had gone home and the boys were asleep, Melker and Mullen still sat on in the kitchen. It was dark now. They could barely see anything more than the light square of the window in the wall and the glow from the fire, which shone behind the grating of the kitchen stove. They could hear the wood burning and crackling, but otherwise all was quiet. Mullen remembered when Melker had lit the first fire in that stove. What a long time ago it was, and what fun everything had been then. Melker had been silent the whole evening, but now he began to speak. All the bitterness in his heart welled out of him. "I'm a failure, I know, an absolute failure." Jorvin never spoke a truer word when she said, "I didn't have the right knack." "What nonsense," said Mullen. "You do have the right knack. I know that very well." "No, I haven't," Melker assured her. "If I had, I wouldn't be sitting here this evening, unable to do a thing when something like this happens. A failure as an author. Why didn't I go into business instead? Then perhaps I could have bought Carpenter's cottage." "I don't want a businessman in the house," said Mullen. "None of us does. We want you." Melker laughed bitterly. "Mullen, what good am I to you? I can't even give my children a summer holiday in peace, and I've always longed to give them so much. I've always wanted to give you all that is wonderful and happy in life." His voice broke and he could not continue. "But that's exactly what you have done, Daddy," said Mullen gently. "You have given us all that's fun and wonderful in life. It has all come from you, and no one but you. You've cared about us, and that's really the only thing that matters." Then Melker cried. It was just what Mullen had said that morning. He was crying before the evening was out. "Yes, I have," he sobbed. "I've cared about you, if that means anything." "It means everything," said Mullen. "I don't want to sit here listening to any more of this nonsense about a father who's failed. Whatever happens to Carpenter's cottage?" In the uttermost parts of the sea. They all awoke next morning with one single thought in their minds. Today at 4 o'clock, Mr. Kahlberg was going to Matson's office in Nordrhein to buy Carpenter's cottage. Nevertheless, they tried to behave normally and pretend that this was a perfectly ordinary day. An ordinary day which began with breakfast at the table in the garden in the usual way, and with the usual wasps buzzing round the marmalade jar. Poor wasps! Pele was sorry for them, and said, "When Mr. Kahlberg tears down the cottage, he'll tear down the wasp's nest too." "Yes, that's the only way of getting rid of them," said Melker dryly. "You tear down the whole house. Why didn't we think of that?" A long, thoughtful silence ensued, and in the middle of it Jorvin arrived. "Uncle Melker, are you deaf? How many more times must I tell you that you're wanted on the telephone?" The Melkersons had no telephone of their own, but used the one in the shop. Melker put down his coffee and ran. Jorvin ran after him. But she was soon back again, looking quite frightened. "Mullen, I think you had better come. I think something else awful has happened. Uncle Melker seems upset." Mullen ran, and so did Johann, Nicholas, and Pele. They found their poor father standing in the middle of the shop, surrounded by Niece, Marta, Teddy, and Freddie, in an anxious ring. He was obviously upset, and tears were running down his cheeks. "It can't be true. No, it can't be true." "Daddy, what is it?" said Mullen in despair. She felt she could not cope with any more upsets just now. Melker sighed deeply. "It's just that," he said, and stopped, and then he pulled himself together. "It's just that I have been given a state grant for 25,000 crowns." There was silence for a long time in the Gronkvist shop. They all stood as if someone had hit them on the head. Jorvin was the only one who had any sense left. "Why have you been given that thing you said?" Melker looked at her, and he smiled triumphantly. "I'll tell you exactly why, young Jorvin. It's because I have got the right knack after all, see? What do you say to that?" "Did they say that, those people who rang?" "Yes, something of the sort. What are you crying for, then?" Jorvin wondered. And then it was suddenly as if they all realized that something pleasant had happened. "Daddy, are we rich now?" asked Pele. "Not exactly rich," said Melker, "but it means—" Then he stopped dead, and his children looked anxiously at him. Surely he wasn't going to start crying again. Suddenly he shouted, "Do you understand what it means? We may be able to buy Carpenter's cottage if it's not too late." He looked at his watch, and at the same moment they heard the steamer Seacrow hooting for departure down the jetty. "Run, Melker, run," said Niece, and Melker ran, shouting, "Come on, Johann and Nicholas, come on, wait." This last word he shouted to the boat. The gangplank had already been drawn up as he arrived, but he looked so desperately imploring, with his hands stretched up to the heavens, that the captains relented. The gangplank was put down again, and Melker rushed on board. He shouted again without turning around, "Come on, Johann and Nicholas, hurry up." It was not until the boat was several yards out from the jetty that he discovered that not only Johann and Nicholas were with him, but Pele and Jorvin too. "Why have you come?" said Melker reproachfully. "This is no game for small children." "We wanted to come too," said Jorvin. "It's ages and ages since I was in Nortage." Melker realized that he could do nothing about it. He could not throw the two of them into the sea, and after all he had just been given a state grant, so it behooved him to be noble and kind. Besides, he was so breathless after his run that he could not utter any more reproaches. "I can still run pretty fast," he said breathlessly. "Not like when I first went to school, of course. I could run 100 yards in 12 minutes 4 seconds then, or 12 seconds 4. Johann and Nicholas looked at each other, and Johann shook his head. "The strange thing with you, Daddy, is that the older you get, the faster you ran when you were at school." It was certainly a good thing for Melker that he could run pretty fast, because he had to do plenty of running that day. It takes time to get to Nortage if one lives on Seacrow Island. First of all, one takes a boat to a jetty on the mainland, and on that jetty one sits waiting for a bus for about an hour, and that bus takes one to Nortage, stopping at many places on the way. It does not hurry, and it keeps to its timetable. At 1 o'clock it is supposed to arrive in Nortage, and at 1 o'clock it gets there, and by that time one has grown gray hairs, thought Melker as he got out of the bus. He had sat in the bus, growing more and more nervous, and saying to himself again and again, "Now, don't expect anything. You won't get Carpenter's cottage, so don't expect it." But he would have a try. He certainly would. And so, with the children in a row behind him, he went as quickly as he could to Matson's office. But Matson was not there. There was only a chubby little typist who looked kind but knew nothing. "Where is Mr. Matson?" asked Melker. She looked at him primly. "How do I know?" "Well, when will he be in?" "How do I know?" Her eyes were large and innocent, and it was quite obvious that she really didn't know anything. But suddenly she took out a mirror from her bag and began to put on lipstick, and that livened her up so much that she suddenly became quite talkative. "He's always out and about. I believe he was going to buy rhubarb at the market, or perhaps he's gone home. Sometimes he goes to the Grand Hotel for a drink." They got no more out of her, and hurried out again as quickly as they had come in. Melker looked at his watch. It was after 2 o'clock. And where was Matson? Where in this charming little town could they find him? They must get hold of him, and quickly. Melker was so nervous that he was trembling, and he did not like having Pele and Jorvin hanging on behind him. It was a hindrance being so many in these narrow streets, so he decided to take action. "Would you like some ice cream cones, children?" he said. Yes, they would, so Melker bought them each an ice cream cone at a kiosk and maneuvered them to a little green park where there was a bench. "You sit here," said Melker, "and eat your ice cream cones and wait until we come back." "What about when we've finished our ice cream?" said Jorvin. "You'll stay here for how long?" asked Jorvin. Until the moss begins to grow on you," said Melker, unkindly. And then he made off with Johann and Nicholas behind him. Pele and Jorvin stayed where they were, eating their ice cream cones. In a dream you sometimes run and run after something that you feel you must find, and you are in a great hurry. It is a matter of life and death. You run and hunt and become more and more anxious, but you never find what you are looking for. It is all in vain. This is exactly what happened to Melker and his boys as they hunted for Matson. He wasn't at the market. Yes, he had been there, one of the market women said, but a long time ago. What about his home then? Where is that? On the other side of town. No Matson there either. Could he really be having a drink at the Grand Hotel? No, that must have been a lie. There was no sign of Matson there, and suddenly Melker realized what a fool he was. He clapped his forehead. "I'm a fool," he shouted. "Why aren't we sitting in Matson's office waiting for him, instead of walking around and getting sore feet?" At that moment, exactly that moment, he made a dreadful discovery. His watch had stopped. Suddenly he saw that the clock on the Grand Hotel showed 5 minutes past 4, not 3:30, as his own wristwatch said. It was a grim moment. "I warned you, Melker, you shouldn't expect anything. How can you think you can possibly buy Carpenter's Cottage when you can't even keep an eye on the time? It's too late now, Melker, at this very moment. Mr. Karlberg is sitting in Matson's office with a cigar in his mouth, chuckling with satisfaction." Melker saw everything so clearly before him that he groaned. Johann and Nicholas were sorry for him, but at the same time they were furious. Why did everything have to be so wrong, and impossible, and so altogether miserable? Johann gritted his teeth. "He may come late, Daddy. Let's take a taxi." So they took a taxi. They were in Matson's office at 10 minutes past 4, but Mr. Karlberg was not a person to be late for appointments. His watch was right. Everything was as Melker had imagined it. There he sat with his cigar in his mouth, looking thoroughly satisfied. Melker grew desperate. "Stop," he shouted. "I'm interested in buying the cottage too." Mr. Karlberg smiled in a friendly way. "You've thought of that a little too late, I'm afraid." Melker turned in despair to Matson. "But Mr. Matson, surely you have a heart. My children and I love Carpenter's Cottage. You can't be so heartless." Matson was not heartless, and only absolutely indifferent and businesslike. "Why didn't you come before then? In matters like this, it's important to decide quickly. People don't stand around waiting. First come, first served. You're too late, Mr. Melkerson. You're too late, Mr. Melkerson." "Those words will ring in my ears as long as I live," thought Melker, and in his despair he turned to Mr. Karlberg. "For my children's sake, can't you give it up?" Mr. Karlberg was offended. "I have a child too, Mr. Melkerson. I have a child too." Then he turned to Matson. Come now, let's find Miss Schlum and sign the contract." Miss Schlum, the happy carpenter's widow. If that's who she was, perhaps he could influence her with his prayers. Perhaps Matson did not have the last word. Melker gritted his teeth. He must try Miss Schlum. Not that he thought it would be any good, but he could not leave a stone unturned. Later, when his last hope had gone, would be time enough to think of those words. "You're too late, Mr. Melkerson." He whispered to the boys, "We'll go to see Miss Schlum too then. Until the moss begins to grow on you," Uncle Melker had said. They were to sit on the bench until then. Jorvin did not agree to this, nor did Pele. An ice cream cone gets eaten so quickly and moss grows so slowly. By now they had been sitting for a long time and they were very hungry, and Pele was so nervous that he could scarcely sit still. Why didn't Daddy come? He felt all on edge, and he had a stomachache too. Jorvin was upset. Nortage was fun. She had been here several times with Mummy and Daddy, and she knew how many interesting things there were to look at, and they had to sit here, stuck to a park bench and feeling hungry at the same time. Have we got to sit here till we die of starvation? She said miserably. Then Pele remembered something which cheered him up. He had 3 crowns in his trouser pocket. I think I'll go and buy us another ice cream cone, he said. So he did. He ran to the kiosk and bought ice cream cones, and then there were only 2 crowns left in his pocket. But an ice cream cone comes to an end so quickly, and the time passes and still no one came. Pele felt prickly all over. I think I'll buy us another ice cream cone, he said. So he did. He ran to the kiosk again, and then there was only 1 crown left in his pocket. And the time passed, and no one came, and the cones had been finished a long time ago. What about buying us another ice cream cone? Suggested Jorvin. But Pele shook his head. No, you shouldn't spend everything you have. You have to keep a little for unforeseen expenses. He had heard Malin say this to Daddy so often, but what unforeseen expenses really meant he did not know. All he knew was that you shouldn't spend all you had. Jorvin sighed. She became more and more restless with every minute that passed, and Pele became more and more nervous. What if Daddy could not find that horrible Matson? Who knew? Perhaps everything had changed. Perhaps Matson had gone home with Mr. Karlberg and sold Carpenter's cottage right away, instead of going to the market and buying rhubarb, instead of hurrying back to his office and selling it to Daddy. And here they had to sit, just waiting and feeling what a stomachache he had. How he hated that Mr. Karlberg, and Matson too. What a pity that Miss Schlom had someone like that to look after her business. Why didn't she do it herself? Miss Schlom, she lived here in Nortage. Yes, she did. Imagine wanting to sell Carpenter's cottage. She must be crazy. He'd like to ask her about it. Do you know Miss Schlom? He asked Jorvin. Of course I do. I know everyone. Do you know where she lives? Yes, said Jorvin. She lives in a yellow house close to a candy shop and a toy shop, which are exactly next door to each other. Pele stood there silent and thinking. His stomach ache was growing worse and worse. At last he jumped to his feet. Come on, Jorvin, let's go and find Miss Schlom. There's something I want to talk to her about. Jorvin jumped up too, happily surprised. But what will Uncle Melcher say? Pele wondered that too. He did not want to think about it just then. He wanted to get in touch with Miss Schlom. Old ladies usually liked him. Surely there would be no harm in asking her, though he did not know exactly what he was going to ask her. He only knew that he could not possibly sit still any longer doing nothing. Jorvin had visited Miss Schlom several times with Mummy and Daddy, and yet she could not find the yellow house now. But she found a policeman, and she asked him, Where is there a candy shop exactly next door to a toy shop? Must you have everything all in one place? Said the policeman, laughing. But then he thought and suddenly realized where she meant and told them how to get there. And they went on through narrow little streets and past rows of little houses and came at last to a toy shop next door to a candy shop. Jorvin looked around, and then she pointed. There Miss Schlom lives in that yellow house. It was a 2-story house with a little garden behind it and a door onto the street. You ring, said Pele. He did not dare. Jorvin put her finger on the bell and left it there for a long time, and then they waited. For a long, long time they waited, but no one came to open the door. She's not at home, said Pele, and he did not know whether he was disappointed or not. In fact, perhaps it was just as well to be able to get out of it, because it was difficult to talk to strange people, but still. "Why has she got the radio on then?" said Jorvin, and put her ear to the door. "I can hear it playing." She rang once more, and then she banged loudly on the door, but still no one came. "She must be home. Come on, we'll look around the other side of the house." They walked around the house. There was a ladder leaning up against a window on the second floor. The window was open, and the radio was on full blast inside. They could hear it very clearly now. "Let's climb up and look in," said Jorvin. Pele was frightened. You couldn't do things like that, just climb up and look in. It was crazy, but Jorvin was set on it. She pushed him towards the ladder from behind. Trembling, he began to climb. He regretted it before he had got halfway and wanted to turn back, but Jorvin was behind him on the ladder, and she would not allow him past her. Hurry up," she said, and pushed him relentlessly upward. Terrified, he went on climbing. What in the world would he say if there was someone inside? There was someone inside. She was sitting in a chair with her back to him, and he was terrified. He stared at her neck for a long time. He coughed first quietly, and then quite loudly. Then the woman in the chair gave a shriek, and she turned around, and he saw that it was Miss Schablum. She was exactly as he had imagined her. She was very old and wrinkled, and had gray hair, kind eyes, and a funny little nose. But she stared at him as if she had seen a ghost. "I'm not as dangerous as I look," Pele assured her in a trembling voice. Miss Schablum laughed. "Oh, really? You really aren't as dangerous as you look." "No," said Jorvin, and popped her head over the window sill. "Good morning, Aunt Schablum." Aunt Schablum clapped her hands together. "Well, I never, if it isn't Jorvin." "Yes, of course it is," said Jorvin, "and this is Pele, who wants to buy Carpenter's Cottage. I suppose that's all right." Miss Schablum laughed merrily, something which came quite naturally to her, and then she said, "I don't usually do business with people hanging outside my window. You had better come in." It was not at all as difficult as Pele had thought it would be to talk to Miss Schablum. "Are you hungry?" was the first thing she said, and that was a fine beginning. Then she took them down to the kitchen and gave them sandwiches and milk. Ham sandwiches and cheese sandwiches and veal sandwiches too. It was a regular party, and while the party was going on she heard everything about Matson and Karlberg and Lottie, and about Westerman and Yoka and Toddy and Yum Yum and Moses and Bosun, about everything that had happened on Seacrow Island. Jorvin talked a great deal about Lottie Karlberg. "Bungalow," she said. "Don't you think that's absolutely crazy, Aunt Schablum?" Yes, Aunt Schablum thought it was absurd, at any rate on Seacrow Island, and as for tearing down Carpenter's Cottage, she had never heard of anything so stupid. A state grant, sore feet, and I don't know what else, all in a single day. It was too much, thought Melker, but he strode on resolutely with Johann and Nicholas at his heels, for they must not let Matson out of their sight. His ugly suit went on in front of them through the streets like a beacon, and it led them to a little yellow house smothered in Cynthia and Jasmine. As Matson rang the bell, a pale-faced Melker came forward. No one was going to stop him from having a word in the discussion. Mr. Karlberg grew angry. Come, Mr. Melkerson, you really must give up. What in the world do you think you are doing here?" "I suppose I have a right to speak to Miss Schablum, if I wish," said Melker bitterly. Matson gave him a cold look. "I thought, Mr. Melkerson, that I had made it clear to you that I am Miss Schablum's agent. What good do you think it will do if you speak to her?" Melker knew only too well that it would do no good, but he had to make one last attempt, and he was not going to allow anyone to stop him. Then the door opened, and there stood Miss Schablum. Matson made his introduction. "This is Mr. Karlberg, who is about to buy Carpenter's Cottage. He paid no attention to Melker, and Miss Shabloom nodded to Mr. Kahlberg and looked him up and down. Melker gave a little cough. If only she would look at him. Perhaps he could catch her eye so that she might understand that it was a question of life and death for him. But Miss Shabloom did not look at Melker. She looked at Kahlberg, and then she said quietly, "Carpenter's cottage is already sold." It was as if she had let a bomb drop. Matson stared sheepishly at her. "Sold, sold," said Mr. Kahlberg. "What do you mean by that?" Melker felt himself turn pale, for now all hope was gone. It did not matter to him who had bought Carpenter's cottage, because it was lost forever to him and his children, and he had known it all the time. But it was strange that it should hurt so much when he finally heard it confirmed. Johann and Nicholas began to cry, silent, bitter crying, which they tried in vain to control. The excitement was over, and they were so tired. Who could help crying? "What do you mean, Miss Shabloom?" said Matson. When his powers of speech returned to him, "Who have you sold it to?" "Come in and you'll see," said Miss Shabloom, and opened the door wide. "You two," she said to Melker and his 2 weeping sons. Melker shook his head. He did not want to see who had bought Carpenter's cottage. It was better not to know who it was. But then he heard from within a voice that he knew only too well. Uncle Melker has got the right knack. I can promise you that, Aunt Shabloom." All was mild confusion in the yellow house for the next hour. Mr. Kahlberg was very angry and shouted and made a fuss and scolded Matson, who was red in the face. "I can't understand all this. You'll have to clear it up, Matson, and then you'll have to act as you think fit." Poor Matson, he seemed to shrink in his ugly check suit, and was suddenly small and meek. "There's nothing to be done," he said in a low voice. "She's as stubborn as an old goat." Miss Shabloom had been standing with her back to them, but now she turned around. "Yes, she is, and she's got sharp ears too." "Though not when the radio's playing," said Jorvin. But Pele was being hugged by his father, pressed hard to his heart. "Pele, my little boy, what have you been doing? What have you been up to?" "I paid a little in advance to Aunt Shabloom," said Pele, "so as to make it sure, and she's given me a receipt too." "Yes, indeed," said Miss Shabloom. "Look," and she held up a shining crown. Mr. Kahlberg turned and went. He slipped out of the door without looking behind him, and after him went Matson. "That's a good thing," said Jorvin, and they all agreed. Johann patted Pele on the head, and Daddy said this wasn't a game for little children. "You were great, Pele." "There's one thing I must ask you, Miss Shabloom, before we leave," said Melker. They were sitting in her kitchen, and she had made some more sandwiches. They were the most delicious sandwiches they had ever tasted. In their lives. Perhaps it was because they had eaten nothing since that morning, or was it because everything was suddenly part of one great happiness, so that even the sandwiches had a heavenly taste? "What do you want to ask?" said Miss Shabloom. Melker looked at her curiously. "Carpenter's cottage, why was it called that? My husband was a carpenter, didn't you know?" "Yes, of course he was," thought Melker. "I must ask something I don't know." Aloud he said, "Carpenter's cottage, yes, of course. And you moved there in 1908. 1907, said Miss Shalom. Melker looked surprised. "Are you sure it wasn't 1908? Then Miss Shalom laughed. "I suppose you'll allow me to know the year I got married." "Oh well, 1 year more or less doesn't matter," thought Melker, and then he said, "May I ask you one more question? What was your husband like? Was he a happy, gay soul?" "Yes, he was," said Miss Shalom. "He was the gayest person I've ever known, though he lost his temper sometimes." Malin wrote in her diary, "Sometimes it seems as if life had picked out one day and said, 'I will give you everything. It shall be one of those rose-red days which shimmer in the memory when all others are forgotten. This is just such a day.' Not for everybody, of course. There are many who are crying now and will remember this day, and despair. But for us, the Melkersons of Carpenter's Cottage on Seacrow Island, this day has been so full of joy that I scarcely know how to bear it." Melker did not know either. He sat on a rock with his feet in the water to soothe their aching. He was fishing. Pele and Jorvin sat on each side of him, looking on. Pele with Yum Yum on his knee and Jorvin with Bosun close beside her. "You haven't got the right knack, Uncle Melker," said Jorvin. "If you carry on like that, you'll never catch a fish." "I don't want a fish," said Melker dreamily. "Why are you sitting here with a rod then?" asked Jorvin. And Melker recited to her in the same dreamy voice. The sun was dipping near the sea. He wished to see its glow. Yes, that's what he wished, to see everything, the sun reflected in the still water, the white seagulls, the grey rocks, the boathouses on the far side of the channel, which mirrored themselves so clearly in the water below them. All that was most dear to him he wanted to see. He would have liked to stretch out his hand and touch them all. "I think I'll stay here tonight and watch the sun rise and see the first flush of dawn." "Mullen won't let you," Jorvin assured him. "The wings of the morning," thought Pele. "I'd like to see that too. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. Just think, they had such a place now, one that was absolutely theirs, a dwelling in the uttermost parts of the sea."